Okay. So open the chat in case there are questions. Thank you for joining me today as we continue our series exploring refuge in 3 jewels. So let's begin with some prayers. So first, before we start prayers, let's just take a moment to settle ourselves, whatever we've been doing all weekend, whatever we've been running around, whatever worldly activities have been occupying our mind. Let's set those to the side and set our focus and our intention very strongly that we've come together today to explore the teachings of the Buddha. And we're doing that not for merely our own benefit, but so that we might be of more benefit to others. So set a strong motivation. The whole reason for my study and for my practice is so that I might be of service to others. And as we set that motivation, now we'll offer some prayers to help prepare our mind. So in our prayer book, volume 1, page 32, excuse me, 34. And I say we offer prayers to help prepare our minds for the teaching, and that's true. But the truth is we need to have both merit and wisdom, right? We need both. And so engaging in practice that isn't just study and isn't just contemplation is important. And so in our sessions, we only do a very short amount of prayers, but prayers are contributing part of the merit aspect to our practice. And, at debate monastery, every debate session, we do at least a half hour of prayers, if not an hour of prayers. In the morning debate, we have usually, in the morning, we do about 20 minutes of prayers. In the evening, we do 30 minutes or an hour, depending on what season it is. And so it's always the practice of engaging in wisdom, right? Always is accompanied by merit because they work together. There's a monk who's relatively new at the monastery who I gave instruction to sometimes, and he has been out of the country for a while with one of his teachers helping at a retreat that his teacher was leading. And so I spoke to him yesterday, and he said, we do so many prayers, and then the teachings happen, and he was helping run review sessions for the teachings, and he goes, I never realized how beneficial it is to do the prayers, to do really intense prayers in a big group, because then when the teachings come, you're so much more focused, and you've already built up an attitude that is preparing yourself for those teachings. And I was like, yeah, well, that's the whole point. That's what we've been talking about. That's why we do it. And I pointed out, that's why it's important to go to pujas at the monastery, and that's why we do prayers at debate. And he goes, oh, okay. So he had like a disconnect where he didn't realize it, but it's good to have that realization. So our prayers, we do it in part to help settle us into the space a little more. And it's to help prepare our minds for the teachings, but it also is to accumulate merit, because that merit itself benefits our wisdom, and then our wisdom benefits our merit. They are mutually beneficial to each other. So with that, let's offer refuge and Bodhicitta prayer. And we'll do it 3 times in Tibetan, and then we'll offer it once in English, and then we'll continue with the other prayers on this page, on these pages rather. Sangye cheran soki chonam la jancho paru dagni kyapsu chi dagi jinsogi pe sonam gi chola penche sangye dru par shok sangye cheran soki chonam la jancho paru dagni kyapsu chi dagi jinsogi pe sonam gi Drola penche sange dru par shok sange chiram soki chonam la chanchu paru dagni kyapsu chi dagi jinsoki pe sonam gi Drola Pincher Sange Druparsho. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness in the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings have happiness in the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from that happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind, and present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to a great enlightenment. And so Mandala offering we'll offer once in Tibetan and then once in English. 사 시부키 주식매도 트람리라블링시 니데겐바디 상계싱두 미테와이 조근나만다싱라 슈퍼쇼. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the four continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and I offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Gurana Mandala Kam Niryatayami. Let's offer praise to Shakyamuni Buddha on page 73, I think. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme God of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, to the foe destroyer, completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme God of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme amongst humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides and then said, I'm supreme in this world. To you who are wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, formed supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the Founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma Refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects. With supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. Great. Thank you. So today we're continuing our discussion of the 3 jewels of refuge and what it means to go for refuge. So before we start, I thought I'd mention that on Monday is Choe Khor Sum, right? It's one of the 4 holidays in the Tibetan Buddhist calendar. It's the holiday celebrating the Buddha's first sermon. So what are the other holidays in the calendar? Do you know? That is one of them, Lavap Duchen. Sorry. So the first holiday, if we go in calendar order, the first holiday is on the 15th of the first month, and that is the Day of Miracles. And really, we celebrate that over the first 2 weeks of the year, but the main holiday is on the 15th. A lot of holidays fall on the 15th, right? Because it's the full moon day. And so the first 2 weeks, for those first 15 days, the Buddha performed a different miracle every day because he was contested by these tirthikas. And so we celebrate the Day of Miracles. That's the first one. And then the second one is on the 15th of the 4th month. That's called Sakadawa Duchen. So the first one is called Chutrul Duchen, so the Day of Miracles. And the second one is Sakadawa Duchen. That's on the 15th of the 4th month. And that is the day that the Buddha manifested the aspect of being born and of achieving enlightenment and of dying, or of passing into parinirvana, all on the 15th of the 4th month. So now we're at the third holiday of the year, which is the day he gave his first sermon. So it's noticeable that in between, when he achieved enlightenment, he waited almost 7 weeks before he gave his first sermon, right? And the reason for that was he, at the time of showing the aspect of achieving enlightenment, realized that the Dharma was so profound that it would be very difficult to cut through the worldly minds of ordinary people. And so he didn't want to teach because he said, no matter what I teach, it will not be understood correctly. So for almost 7 weeks, he didn't teach. And then Brahma and Indra requested him to teach. So then he gave his first sermon, and the first sermon he gave was to the 5 other ascetics who he had been practicing asceticism with near the Narayanjana River. And they, the ones that had, when he finally cut his hair and took a bath for the first time, they are the ones that rejected him and said, you're not a real seeker. But they saw him on the road and they realized that he is now a Buddha. He realized something they didn't realize. And he gave the first sermon to them. So that's the third holiday. And then the fourth one is on the 22nd of the 9th month, and that is Labap Duchen. So when the Buddha descended from the one of the god realms where he had gone to teach Dharma to his mother, because she had been reborn in a god realm, because she died giving birth to him. So there's only 4 major holidays. There are other small holidays, like in our tradition, we celebrate the anniversary of Lama Tsongkhapa's passing away. And there are a couple of other small holidays, but there are 4 main holidays. And so on wheelchairing day, the Buddha taught the first sermon, and the content of the first sermon is the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are the philosophical foundation for all Buddhist thought. Any Buddhist lineage, any Buddhist country, tradition, all is going to come back to the Four Noble Truths. But what allowed him to teach those Four Noble Truths at that time was he had realized the Dharma completely. And when the 5 other ascetics who had been practicing with him saw him, they instantly saw him and realized that he was someone who could protect them from the suffering of samsara. So they recognized him as a source of refuge when they saw him. And that is what made that teaching so profound, to them at least, is because they recognized him as a source of refuge, right? And so it's a great time to be discussing refuge, right? I mean, it's always a good time to talk about refuge, but it's especially nice near Wheel Turning Day, so Chukradushin. So it's good to just keep that in mind that, as we get near these holidays, more people are practicing and studying. So it kind of increases the mojo a little bit, that's what they said. So, refuge is not a new idea, right? We take refuge all the time. Even before we ever found Buddhism, before anything, we took refuge all the time, just not in important things. We took worldly refuge. We look to worldly things as if they're going to save us, right? So what do we mean by refuge? What is refuge in general? What's the word refuge mean? Shelter, right? Shelter, safety, protection. When you're going somewhere or to someone for refuge, you're expected to protect you from something, right? And our problem I mean like all sentient beings who are suffering in samsara, is that we go towards worldly refuges, but we expect them to give us super mundane protection from samsara. So if you go to someone who is trapped in samsara, they can't free you from samsara because they themselves are trapped in samsara, right? And so some of our refuges that we go to are very simple. Like, our first refuge when we grew up is like our parents, right? Whenever anything goes wrong, you expect your parents can fix everything, right? That's just your natural instinct. No matter what is wrong, my parents will take care of it. And so that is like a worldly example of a refuge. And as a child, that's an appropriate refuge, but it's only going to provide worldly benefit, right? And so there are worldly refuges that we can go to, and they'll be useful to us, even now, as practicing Buddhists, as long as you realize this is a worldly refuge, right? Like if it is raining outside, I can't be like, Buddha Dharma Sangha, please protect me from the rain. Like that's not going to help, right? So I take out an umbrella, and this is a worldly refuge. But I recognize all this umbrella is doing is preventing rain from falling on me. It's not giving me any important safety, right? And I mean, that's a silly example, but we can think of other things in our life. We have friends, family members, spouses that we can go to for support and for help and for benefit in many ways, right? But it's not going to be benefit that lets us be free from samsara, but it might be the benefit we need at that moment to navigate whatever we're going through, right? So it's okay to balance those two, as long as you realize that when we go to a worldly refuge, we need to only be expecting worldly results, right? And if we have that mindset, then it's perfectly appropriate to do. But it's just important to not expect that a worldly refuge is going to free you from samsara. If you don't have that mindset, then what do you think are the dangers of worldly refuge or of temporary refuge, transitory, superficial refuge? Sorry? Yeah, well, it's temporary. The damage is that, or the danger is that you go to this thing with, even if it's not explicit, with the implicit idea that this is actually going to save you or protect you. And then when it can't live up to that ideal, because it's never going to be able to, because it's temporary, it's superficial, then you end up suffering more as a result, right? You're looking to something and expecting something it'll never give you. And so you've created the situation where then you increase your own suffering and you don't get any real relief in the first place anyway. So you've only doubled down, The other reason they're dangerous is because they're tempting. Like worldly refuges are sometimes very easy, right? Like you look at the time of the Buddha and also in Tibet, and like one of the things that a lot of the teachings, if you read some of the early, both Indian and early Tibetan teachings, when they're talking about worldly refuges, they're talking about like worldly gods that people would make offerings to and do things like that. And that's really easy. If you have this like worldly god or a protector being or like a wrathful sometimes they're called landowners or other kind of these worldly non-human entities that have some sort of power, right? They have some sort of power beyond human power. you think I could just make offerings to them, whether it be sacrifices or money, whatever kind of offerings to them, and then that makes everything easier for me. Like that's a lot easier than doing the work for yourself. So it's very tempting to reach out towards these worldly um, refuges because it's just easier, right? Like I can just put all the responsibility on someone else. And yes, I maybe have to make an offering. I have to make a tithing. I have to do something like this. But you're kind of getting rid of all your responsibility. And by doing that, you're getting rid of all of your autonomy, all your power as well. But it feels a lot easier sometimes because the Dharma expects a lot of us, right? And when we go towards actual refuges, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, they're always working to benefit us in every way possible. But we still have to do the work ourselves, right? They're not able to free us from suffering ourselves. We can't just make offerings to the Buddha and that's enough for us to not suffer anymore. Like it would be great if that could work that way. The Buddha also agrees. He said that would be great. But then none of you would be suffering because I have infinite compassion and I would not let you suffer if I had the power to stop it. But I don't. So that's the real danger of worldly refuges is that it's very easy to mistake them or in our minds to get mixed up and think that they're offering us some real benefit. And they're very tempting because they're easy. A lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time they're easier than doing the work ourselves. Right?
Venerable.
Yes.
If I may ask a question, and if
Sure.
it's not related, then you can just, tell me so. So Brahma and Indra are also worldly gods, worldly beings, not worldly, godly or whatever kind of beings.
Yeah, we call them worldly gods. Yeah.
Worldly gods, yes. And they clearly they do play they have some role in the Buddhist scriptures. So so they, one is just supposed to be reading that and not ascribing any other godly characteristics to them, is it?
Depending on, so the Buddhist cosmology recognizes that there are beings that are not human beings, such as the gods of the desire realm, such as Indra and Brahma, and there are other levels and types of gods in the desire realm, right? We have desire realm gods, form realm gods, and formless realms gods. There's all these different divine beings, and some of them intercede in human affairs, and some of them don't. And some of them have what we would consider supernatural powers, for lack of a more convenient word. And so they can offer us some benefit, right? They can offer some help, And you look at especially places like Tibet, they would make offerings to the local, whatever gods lived in the local area, because that would help make sure their crops grow. It would prevent hailstorms. It would do things like this. So that was a common practice. And Buddhist cosmology accepts the role of these non-human beings in our lives. The difference is we don't look at them to actually free us from samsara. They can offer some temporary benefit, and especially those, and we look at the Dharma protectors and others who are aligned to the teachings of the Buddha and help encourage people to practice the Dharma and help create beneficial conditions for people to study and practice the Dharma, then it's useful to make offerings to them if we like, and it's useful to look at them with respect, but we recognize them as still being trapped in samsara themselves. So they're never going to be able to free us from samsara. All they can help us do is they can help our material world a little bit to some degree or another. So that is how we look upon them.
Okay, thank you.
And the gods, Brahma and Indra, for instance, are very long-living gods. Like the lifespan of a god of the desire realm far outlasts like the lifespan of a human, right? And the same with lower realms as well. So the non-human beings' lifespans can't be measured in human lifespans, or they can. There's if you look in the Kalatraka Tantra, especially, this really wonky math, but like how many, like one lifespan in this realm equals like 10 lifespans in this realm equals 20 lifespans in this realm. So that kind of mathematics does exist if you are interested in it. I don't really care about it myself because I understand the point of it. I don't need to do the calculus. But so we believe they exist, and they exist in a way that humans aren't used to existing. But they don't, in the end, all they can do is very limited benefit. And the reason, the thing to say is, like, I say it's very limited benefit. We're often used to living in a world of lack, right? A world where we don't have all the things we need, where we feel like we have gross suffering all around us. Never mind our emotional suffering, never mind our mental suffering. But like most of us experience coarse suffering all the time. And if we just look around us, there's so much poverty and there's war and there's violence. There's a lot of like very coarse suffering that we experience, right? And so we look at some of the powers of these gods and it looks like they might be incredibly, amazingly powerful. And when we say, well, that's really only temporary benefit because it's only focused on this life, it may seem incredibly powerful to us because we have so much core suffering in our lives that this seems really magnificent. But if you take a big picture, all it's benefiting is this one small life, this lifetime only. And as long as we're only focused on this lifetime, then that benefit seems amazing. And it seems like the most important thing ever. Why wouldn't you worship it all the time? But when you take a step back, as we're asked to do as Buddhists, and say, focusing on this lifetime alone is not enough. If all of our activities are focused on this lifetime alone, that's not even a Buddhist practice, right? When we look at the different levels of Buddhist motivation, the lowest level of Buddhist motivation is at least looking towards having beneficial rebirths and being reborn again as a human or as one of the upper rebirths, so you can continue to practice Dharma. That's the smallest level of motivation. So if you're just focused on this life alone, then that's not even quote unquote Buddhist practice. So these gods may seem incredibly powerful, and yet we say that their benefit is limited because it's limited to this life alone, right? And sometimes that seems like a contradiction because we don't have that power. And so since we lack that power, it may seem quite awesome, right? Like unbelievable. But in the end, it's very, very limited.
Gods undergo suffering of change, and therefore like, they're within samsara. So
oh yeah, 100% in samsara, 100%.
So like what we perceive as enjoyment, what we think of as godly enjoyment is actually also conditioned by change, and therefore causes them suffering.
Well, it depends on what god realm, right? There are different god realms that experience suffering different ways. The one that's most often talked about, because it comes up when you study the perfect human rebirth, right? And one of the things that you're free of, you have the 10 endowments and the freedoms and the endowments, right? And one of the things you're free of is being born as a long life god. So a long life god is one particular god realm that gods are born into. And the thing with the long life gods, and this is not true for all gods, but it's kind of used as a fill-in as an example. They don't have any physical suffering, right? And they live their lives mostly in a sense of worldly bliss. But then as their time of their death approaches, they are able to foresee when their death is going to happen. And they've exhausted so much karma living a life of bliss that they almost always are reborn in the lower realms in their next lives. And they have the ability to foresee that. Like they see the lower realms where they're going to be reborn. So they have this incredible mental anguish, right? And at the same time, once their death approaches, their body starts smelling and all the other gods like avoid this, right? Because like everyone realizes this isn't a good scene. So the mental anguish they experience, at least as is taught in the scriptures, is far more egregious than any suffering we could experience as humans. Like it's overwhelming the amount of mental anguish they experience because they are still in samsara. So as you say, they are, all of the bliss they've experiencing. So as we talk about the three types of suffering, which actually will come up a little later, but the one I often talk about the most as the one I think most important for us to study is the suffering of change. All of our experience of worldly happiness is really itself a type of subtle suffering. They experience that as well, but they don't register it as suffering, right? Because everything is too nice for them, everything's too blissed out for them. And so it's not until near the end of their lifetime that they realize that they've, wasted all the opportunities they have. So in that way, yeah, the gods are subject to the same thing as us. They don't often have the same suffering that we have. The core suffering that we experience, and that is experienced in the lower realms, they don't experience that, or at least some of them don't, depending on what realm you're talking about. But the other two types of suffering, definitely. So that is why it can be very flashy and exciting and easy to look for worldly refuge. And I think it's useful for me when in my life I find myself resorting to worldly refuges and then being very aware of it, because I do it all the time. Like just the other day, literally yesterday, I was preparing for this class and I was like, okay. And I had class with one of my teachers and it was like exhausting because we went through like 30 pages of text in the span of an hour. So I was very tired. And then I wanted to do preparation for this class. And I said, okay, I just want to listen to 3 songs. So I'm going to listen to 3 songs just to calm myself down, put myself like in a different state of mind, and then I'll do this. And like that is a type of going to something for refuge. Now, I try to be aware that this is just, in an ideal world, I wouldn't need to do that, right? If I had enough power over my mind, I wouldn't need those external stimuli. But for that moment, I was like, you know what? Everything's running around in circles. If I just put on a little bit of music, 15 minutes of music, that's going to give me a chance to like center myself and then turn to my new task, whatever it may be, right? That's a type of refuge. Now, I was very aware of what I was doing, and I was aware this isn't going to actually improve my mind, but it's okay to use worldly means if you understand what you're doing, right? if I didn't think this is going to save me from samsara, but it's going to help me. And ideally, in the future, I wouldn't have to do that. But right now, since I still have a long way to go in my practice, it's okay, right? So we have to be gentle with ourselves and say, sometimes I do need to just take these worldly pleasures. Like sometimes I need to go get a piece of cake. Like sometimes you have to, right? And that's fine. Obviously, you can become dependent on these things, and you don't want to make excuses for yourself and for like indulging bad behavior. But sometimes you need to do that, as long as you're aware of what you're doing. Yeah.
But isn't that, I mean, something as simple as music? I'm not talking about things that maybe drugs or something like that. There's nothing wrong in it, right? I mean, sometimes we could say, okay, your mind's busy and you want to go for a walk. Is it wrong? Because sometimes a walk is healthy. Listening to music can stimulate your body in a healthy way. So is it falling on wrong in that sense?
Again, it's what you're expecting the results of it to be. So that's what I'm saying, is like that kind of refuge, looking at that as a very temporary refuge is not wrong. If you're saying, I know that like right now, this is going to be healthy for my body and mind, and this is going to allow me to put myself into a zone where I can be more productive, I can be more helpful, more beneficial. So if that is what your goal is, then you're looking at it and saying, I'm expecting worldly results from this worldly refuge. And therefore there's not a mismatch, right? But if you expect that I can go on a walk every day after my evening meal, and that's going to bring me closer to being free from suffering in the big picture, you know what I mean? And this, like using these simple things is kind of like it's a hard example because no one really expects to be free from suffering by listening to music. But I was using it as an example, right? They're good examples because we do them all the time and because they're easy to notice in our lives. And if we can pay attention to those really coarse examples, then other times when we go to other places for refuge that are maybe more subtle, that we really expect these things to provide us safety, but then they don't, right? That is harder to see sometimes. Like I don't actually expect listening to music for 15 minutes is going to provide me safety, but I know it's going to help me put in the right frame of mind, right? So no, in that regard, that's my point, is that these kind of things, especially these coarse ones like we're talking about, aren't bad as long as you use them with the right mindset and say, this is what I expect of it. And if your expectations and what is being offered aren't discordant, then it can be healthy or it can be useful. And again, if we were Buddhas or even more advanced in our practice, we wouldn't have to do those things, right? So you always at least have some sort of, like for me, a recognition that, okay, I am not a perfect practitioner. I still have a ways to go. If I was like perfectly practitioner, then I wouldn't need to rely on these external stimuli because I could just focus my mind, right? If I had achieved even calm abiding, when you achieve calm abiding, shine or shamatha, like your mind can focus on any object single pointedly without any effort at all. And it's blissful, that experience of concentration, because you've built up the power of your mind to do that. I haven't built up the power of my mind to do that, right? So I need to work my way into it, right? So as long as I do it with that recognition, right, then I think it is a perfectly healthy part of us trying to do our best in samsara. So studying refuge, where are we in the long run? Thinking of the stages of the Lam room, right? We know the Lam room is divided into 3: small scope practices, medium scope practices, and then the great scope practices. Where are we? Small scope. What precedes this?
Suffering of the lower realms.
Okay, suffering of lower realms. And what else? That's the immediate preceding. Yes.
What else? Karma and no, sorry.
Well, it's understandable that you're confused because so preceding this, we're in the small scope, and refuge is really considered the doorway into becoming a Buddhist, right? And so it's the beginning of the small scope practice in many ways is refuge. Even though we have these kind of preliminary practices of studying perfect human rebirth, or at least in our tradition, following Lama Tsongkhapa, first studying proper devotion to a guru, then perfect human rebirth, and death and impermanence, then the suffering of the lower realms. In the FPMT program, the Discovering Buddhism program, which we've kind of been following for the last couple months, studying karma comes before studying refuge, right? So that I can understand why you're confused. But in the Lam room, it comes afterwards. Now, the reason it comes beforehand, I mean, I didn't organize the DB program, but my impression is why they like teaching it beforehand. And again, the DB, the Discovering Buddhism program, you can really teach the modules in any order, hypothetically. But the reason they put it before is because when we talk about the refuge of Dharma, part of it is understanding karma is a useful way to understand the refuge of the Dharma. And so they like to give that teaching first to give more grounding. So it's understandable to misunderstand the order. But karma, when we study karma, and that usually is following the suffering of the higher realms, right? And renunciation. Those all go together. And so those are the medium scope, because renunciation is trying to be free from samsara, right? Whereas the small scope is trying to have a better rebirth, not necessarily free from samsara. So we're still in the small scope. This is actually like a real entryway into the small scope, is setting refuge. Because having actual refuge is what distinguishes you as a Buddhist or a non-Buddhist, right? So the entryway into Buddhist practices, to some extent, is a mind of refuge. So it's important to study the refuge. So what are the two causes of refuge? There are two main causes. I know a lot of this is review because this is our third week, but I want to go over it. I think it's useful. I'm sorry. I know there are people in the comments here. I see them now. I'm not very good at paying attention to them, so I apologize. But I see that some of you are having good answers here as well. But what are the two primary causes for refuge? Keep it. Healthy fear, exactly. This is the main reason that it's taught after the suffering of the lower realms, right? It's because you want to have a fear of suffering, especially a fear of suffering in the lower realms, is one of the primary causes. And then we actually look at that in three ways. As we want to actually develop Mahayana refuge. And so then we think of refuge according to the three scopes. But in general, in many of the sutras, the cause of refuge is fear of being reborn in the lower realm, or the fear rather of the sufferings of the lower realms. But then we like to expand it, and so that is the cause for a small scope refuge, is fear of suffering in the lower realms. Then the fear of the suffering of samsara in general, so we understand all the sufferings of samsara, the lower and the upper realms, that is the cause for a medium scope refuge. And then as people who are trying to engage in the Mahayana refuge, that is a fear of suffering of samsara, not for ourselves, but of all sentient beings who suffer in samsara. So that becomes our motivation to engage in the Mahayana refuge. But ultimately, it's fear, a healthy fear, right? That's the first cause. And then what's the second cause?
Recognition that the three jewels lead us out of samsara.
Exactly. Having confidence that there is a refuge, right? Having confidence that there is an authentic refuge that can actually free you from the suffering that you fear, right? Whether it be the suffering of lower realms or the suffering of samsara in general. Okay. And now I think for a lot of us, we don't spend a lot of our time thinking about the suffering of the lower realms, right? And so how is that really a freedom? Like, I don't need that as a motivating factor for me to take refuge because I don't really think about it a lot. Just having confidence in the three jewels is enough. But if you think about it, what do you mean by having confidence in the three jewels? You have confidence that they can free you from samsara, right? Or that by taking refuge in them, you'll find freedom from samsara. Why would you need freedom from samsara if it wasn't suffering that you were trying to avoid? So we may not have the explicit mindset. For many of us, this is, I don't want to suffer in samsara. I have to go find refuge from it. But that is still motivating us accepting that there is an authentic refuge, right? If we didn't actually recognize that there was suffering that we're trying to be free from, there'd be no reason to go for refuge. There'd be no reason to look outside of ourselves to have any kind of freedom if we didn't believe in that suffering that we wanted to be free of. So for some of us, that first one isn't really explicit all the time, right? But I think it's always there. And it's an important, when we're studying refuge, to really think of it, that it is my wish to be free from suffering that is motivating me to look for ways to be free from that suffering. And I find confidence that the path to that freedom lies in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then as a Mahayana practitioner, I recognize that that freedom I'm searching for isn't for myself alone, but for other sentient beings as well.
Genla, I have a question. What
Sure.
is the relationship between fear of suffering and renunciation? Because in our language, we call renunciation vairagya. What is the relationship between these two?
So renunciation is the embodiment of the middle school practice that, wish to be free from the suffering of all of samsara. So in the teachings for the fear of suffering, it especially focuses on the suffering of the three lower realms, which is one of the motivating factors the minimum motivating factor for taking refuge. And renunciation goes one step beyond that and says, not only do I want to be free from the suffering of the three lower realms, I want to be free from the suffering of all of samsara. And so that is renunciation, is the mind that wishes to be free from samsara entirely. So it is not a fear, but it is the mind that comes out of the fear, right? And it is very similar. It emerges in a way that is similar to refuge, in that it has as its motivating factor, or one of its primary motivating factors, a fear of suffering in samsara. And so that fear of suffering in samsara leads you to take refuge, and then that leading you to take refuge leads you to realize that you want to have a mind that is free from all suffering, and therefore you develop a worldly renunciation and then eventually an actual renunciation, right? So that fear serves as the motivating factor. If you weren't afraid of samsara or suffering, then there'd be no reason to try to be free from it. And so renunciation is the wish to be free from samsara and to be free from all worldly suffering of the 6 rungs. So if we want to think of refuge as the result of a healthy fear of suffering, then of course that's why we study suffering first. And so we first study the suffering in the lower realms. And then it's also useful to study the suffering in general. So we study the 3 types of suffering, right? So what are the 3 types of suffering? Suffering of suffering. Suffering of change.
All-pervasive suffering.
And all-pervasive suffering, and the suffering of compounded phenomena. So these are the 3 types of suffering. And as we mentioned, the suffering of suffering is the coarsest one. That's the suffering that even animals can experience, and all beings want to be free from it. That's illness, that's sickness. And that is the one we spend most of our time thinking about if we're not engaged in spiritual practice, because that's the one that's most readily apparent to us. But that is kind of the least, in my opinion, like the least, it's important, but it's more important to think of the suffering of change. So the suffering of change is really the recognition that everything we consider to be worldly happiness is itself a type of suffering. Because all it really is the transference or the transformation of one type of worldly suffering to a different type of worldly suffering. And in that change, by experiencing a temporary relief from the world of suffering we were previously experiencing, we experience it as happiness or bliss. And that itself is a type of suffering. Now, again, this doesn't mean we should never be happy. This is the important thing. And I know you've all heard this before from me, but I feel the need to repeat it because I don't want to be ever out of context, that it doesn't mean we should avoid all happiness, but it's truly, we should recognize that worldly happiness is only going to be worldly happiness. It's never going to be anything beyond that. If we grasp onto worldly happiness, thinking it's actual, genuine happiness, we're always going to be disappointed. So that's the important part of this, right? And once you really have a grasp of how that type of suffering works in your life, then that is what motivates you, or it can very strongly motivate you to want to find a freedom that's beyond that. Because if you said this worldly happiness I'm experiencing is temporary, it's going to go away, it's not going to last, it isn't actual happiness, right? It's just a temporary change of condition. When you actually are able to wrap your mind around that, then you can still experience whatever happy feelings that you experience as a result of that, but it really motivates you to want more, to say there is a lot more than this. Like there is a happiness that is far beyond what this temporary happiness is. This temporary happiness is nothing compared to the types of happiness that bodhisattvas and Buddhas experience. So there's a capacity that I have, my mind has, to experience a far greater happiness than this. But I'm grasping onto this small, tiny baby happiness as if it was real happiness. And I'm not letting myself realize my full potential. So actually recognizing that temporary or worldly happiness as a type of suffering motivates you to practice, right? It's like a positive motivation. And then the suffering of all compounded phenomena or all pervasive suffering is, for our purposes, is simply the recognition that as long as we exist in a state of being where we have the capacity to suffer, that itself is a type of suffering. That's why it's all pervasive. Like all of samsara is pervaded by this capacity to suffer. So as long as you are a samsaric being, you have the capacity to suffer, and that itself is a type of suffering. And the only way to be free of that's the most subtle type of suffering, is to actually be free from samsara, which is you have to have a direct realization of the nature of reality. And then through that direct realization of the nature of reality, that serves as an antidote to all of your afflictions, right? Slowly, slowly, as your meditation deepens. That one is useful to know because it helps locate what it means to live in samsara. But at the same time, it's not as applicable to our everyday life, at least in my experience. So I like to focus on the second one, even though that third one is quite important and it's uncommon to Buddhism. Like other religious traditions don't think of suffering in that way. So it's important to understand it, since it is uncommon to the Buddhist teachings, but in my everyday life, it isn't as useful for me personally as the second type of suffering, especially. And the first type of suffering is important insofar as it's unavoidable. So recognizing that it's unavoidable and that it is temporary and it's suffering of this life only, that allows me to experience it and then not grab onto it as being like the worst thing ever, right? When I get sick, when I hurt myself, instead of really allowing that to create more mental suffering for myself, usually if I, am in a good place, I can experience it with a more a stable mind that doesn't allow any sort of emotional disturbance, even if I have physical suffering. So it's important to think of physical suffering as well. But for me, the second one is the most important to push my practice forward. So you'll have to experiment in your practice and see, but meditating on all three. Then, of course, it's important to think of the six types of suffering of samsara, or like the 6 characteristics of samsara that that are the cause for it to be, or indicative of why it is pervaded by suffering. So what are those 6 characteristics of samsara? So again, this is actually taught when you're studying renunciation. So when you're teaching the Lamrim, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in Lamrim. This is material that would be taught after, literally the next subject. When you're studying renunciation is when this would come. But the 6 general characteristics of samsara that make it a cause of suffering. So sometimes it's referred to as the 6 types of suffering in samsara. But the 6 general characteristics, the first one is that samsara is indefinite, but there is nothing definite or 100% confirmed in samsara, right? Nothing always goes the way it's supposed to go. Like everything is indefinite now. Nothing is guaranteed, okay? So that lack of guarantee, that lack of stability like samsara is pervaded by it, right? And so because of that, that is one of the conditions that leads you to experience suffering. The second one, I'm going to go through these quickly because I want to get to this one material. And we'll talk about these more. But so if I go through them quickly and you have questions, feel free to ask them. The first one, like I said, is this, the samsara is indefinite. And that doesn't mean indefinite as in non-ending, because that word can also mean that, I realize in English. It's indefinite in that there's no guarantees. Nothing is guaranteed one way or the other, right? For our purposes, that's fine. The second one is that samsara itself has the nature of dissatisfaction. Like that is the very rangshin, the essence of samsara is dissatisfaction. That as long as you are a samsaric being, you can't ever have actual satisfaction. It's always going to be tempered by your worldly experience only. You can have tastes of it, especially when you achieve the high levels of meditative equipoise. In really deep meditation, you can experience some sort of bliss and happiness that is like close to not being samsaric. But as long as you're a samsaric being, it's still samsara, right? So the samsara itself has the nature of dissatisfaction. Then as long as we are samsaric beings, we're going to have to leave our body again and again and again. That's the third characteristic or nature of samsara. And that goes hand in hand with the fourth one, which is that we'll have to take rebirth again and again and again. And those then go on with the fifth one, which is that our status goes from high to low, high to low, high to low, again and again and again. Again, with that is kind of reflecting the first one, that nothing is definite, nothing is stable, right? Due to everything being impermanent. And we can even see our status going high to low in this very life, never mind from one life to the next, where we might be reborn in like a wealthy family versus an impoverished family versus an animal or whatnot. Even in this life, we can see how our status, like our worldly status and our reputation fluctuates, right? So we go high status to low status, up and down, up and down, up and down. And then the sixth characteristic of samsara that makes it pervaded by suffering is that we go through samsara alone without any companions. And that sounds really harsh, right? Because we will say, well, we have our teachers that we rely on. We have the Buddha Dharma Sangha, who are the refuge that we seek out. We have our Dharma friends who support us, and that's all true. But ultimately, our journey is one we have to take on our own. And all of those conditions can help us, right? And our teachers are incredible lights that beckon us onto the path of spiritual practice and Dharma. But ultimately, we have to walk that path by ourselves. So samsara itself is a fundamentally lonely experience, right? And then we can find ways to make connections that dissipate that loneliness. But at its essence, samsara is a lonely experience, right? So those 6 characteristics help us think of why we really want to be free from samsara, right? So those are some of the things we meditate on when we try to develop renunciation. But for those of us who are trying to develop a proper understanding of a mind of refuge, those are part of the types of fear of samsara that we either need to actively cultivate, or we at least need to be aware of when we are motivated to seek out freedom from suffering, right? If we don't understand the suffering we're trying to be free from, how can we ever really be free from it, right? That gets back to why the Buddha, when he taught the first sermon, and he taught the Four Noble Truths, that he taught suffering first. When you study the Dharma, when you study the text like in an academic way, they show different ways of organizing the Four Noble Truths and what the benefit of teaching them in different ways are, right? So there's like, we look at the Four Noble Truths and 2 of them are causes and 2 of them are results, right? So like suffering is a result and the cause is karma and delusions, which is the second. And then cessation is a result and the path is the cause, right? So there's 2 causes and 2 results. And there are other ways to group the Four Noble Truths. And there are different ways, there are different reasons to teach them in different sequence when you're engaging in study or meditation or practice. But the reason that the heart teaching of them teaches suffering first is because we've spent so much of our time not realizing the depth of our suffering that it's important to realize that so we can develop a genuine wish to be free from it. And then we combine that with recognizing the good characteristics of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha to realize they are authentic sources of refuge. And that leads us towards a spiritual path, right? Which is why it's taught in that order. So thinking of that, we think of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. These are 3 sources of refuge. And so for the purposes of going for refuge, for Mahayana refuge, we say not just Shakyamuni Buddha, but all the Buddhas, right? But when we're studying refuge, we only talk about Shakyamuni Buddha. But then we can take anything that we teach about Shakyamuni Buddha and then expand it to all the different Buddhas that exist. And we don't talk in the teachings about going to our Lama for refuge, our Guru, when you have a real Guru. That's because the Guru is the embodiment of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And so anything that is taught about the Buddha, we can consider our Guru, the refuge of our Guru, to be contained within that as well. So especially for those of us practicing in the Tibetan tradition that have such an importance on Guru devotion, even though it's not explicitly mentioned in the teachings on refuge, we understand it to be incorporated within the teachings about the Buddha refuge and also as being the embodiment of all 3. So that's a good thing to think about and to know. So what is so we say the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? These are our 3 jewels. There's a couple different translations of the word. The word jewel comes from a couple different Tibetan sources. Sometimes Rinpoche means like a precious object, and that's translated as jewel sometimes. But here, the word jewel, at least in Tibetan, is kunchok. And so kunchok, kun means rare, uncommon. Chok means supreme or excellent, right? So the word jewel, I guess the word jewel somewhat captures that idea, but these are things that don't exist everywhere. And when you find them, they're incredibly special, right? So, and sometimes in some of the prayers, you'll see like the 3 rare and sublime ones. It's often referenced. That's a more literal translation of the word kunchok, which we often just translate as jewel. But so sometimes if you see in a prayer, the 3 rare and sublime ones, that's just the translator being more literal or more poetic. So when we try to think of, well, not just anything can be a kunchok, right? Not just anything can be an actual refuge that'll free us from samsara. And so since this is the 3rd class, what is the actual refuge? Right? The Dharma refuge is the actual refuge, right? What is the analogy that is taught when we study the refuge, the three jewels? The most common, there's a lot of them, the most common one.
Not sure, but the doctor, medicine.
Exactly. So if we think of the Buddha as the great physician or the great doctor, right? So that's one of his like titles. That's one of the names that's given to the Buddha. So if the Buddha is like a great physician, then the Buddha refuge is like a doctor. And so the job of the doctor is to diagnose your illness and then prescribe you the requisite restorative to cure you of your illness. So if the Buddha jewel is the Dharma, is the doctor, then the Dharma jewel is the actual medicine that is prescribed, right? So the medicine, it exists on its own, but you don't know to take it if you don't have someone pointing out the sickness, right? And then if the Dharma jewel is the medicine, then the Sangha jewel are like the nurses or the attendants who show you how to take the medicine and make sure you're doing your physical therapy and so forth, right? They're the ones that keep you in line, okay? And the importance of that analogy is that we see how the three jewels work together, and they're all important for our practice, and they all are sources of refuge for us in our everyday practice. But the most important one is the Dharma jewel, which is what we're trying to manifest. We're trying to realize the Dharma jewel in our minds. But when we need to seek out a competent doctor in order to know what medicine we need to take, right? So we need to seek out an appropriate Buddha jewel, because that is who is going to teach us in the appropriate way. So there are 4 characteristics that qualify the Buddha as being an authentic source of refuge. Okay. So the first of those characteristics is that the Buddha is without fear. And what that means is there's 2 ways to interpret this. The first way to interpret it is that the Buddha has no worldly fear, right? It has no worldly fear because there's nothing that can harm a Buddha. If a Buddha chooses to manifest in our realm of existence, then, for instance, His Holiness Dalai Lama, we believe he's a Buddha, he's manifesting as a human. So to our appearance, he's experiencing the suffering of a human birth, right? Old age, sickness, and so forth. That's to our appearance because he's manifested as a human. But as a Buddha, he's not actually experiencing suffering. He has nothing to be afraid of, right? He may be putting on this display because that's what's expected of a human being, and that's due to the karma of the disciples that are engaging with him. But as a Buddha, he has no worldly fear. He can't be harmed in any way.
I remember when he was having surgery on his knee, he was so relaxed. And it really made me think, if I am having surgery, I want to be like that.
Yeah, right? I mean, and that's another one of the reasons why him displaying a human rebirth is so useful, or a human appearance is so useful, because then when he does experience worldly suffering, he can do it in such a way that offers a role model for us, right? To see that he's going, he had his gallbladder removed, he had knee surgery, all these things. None of it affects his mind, I've seen other great teachers as well who may or may not, be Buddhas, but even if we just recognize them as realized beings who, as they get older, have like incredible physical ailments, and seeing them teach and not let their physical difficulties get in the way of their practice is really profound. I told the story of when I was in Boston, our teacher there, when I first joined, 6 months after I started at that center, he told us that he had been diagnosed with liver cancer. And he continued to teach for 2 more years after his diagnosis, or 1.5 years or 2 years, give or take. And he didn't do any Western medicine. He did only Tibetan medicine. He went to Western doctors and got all the scans done. And then he sent them to His Holiness's doctor in Dharamsala, who then gave him some Tibetan regime to do. By the end, by the time he stopped teaching, he was like a living skeleton. He was so frail, so skinny. He would take these thick, like huge, thick blankets that they'd have to wrap around him. Otherwise, he'd be freezing cold. And yet, he still walked into the Gompa and did 3 prostrations before he sat on the throne and started teaching. And it might take him 5 minutes to do 3 prostrations, but he would do it every time. And when it got to the very end and he couldn't physically do a prostration, you could tell that he stopped and did a prostration anyway, even if it wasn't physical. And you could see that his physical body was failing him. It didn't have any effect on his mind. So it's really inspiring to see that in our teachers, right? But so that's one way of thinking of the Buddhas being fearless, is that they're not afraid of any worldly fear. Now, the other way this is explained is that there are 4 characteristics of Buddhahood that are called the 4 fearlessnesses, the 4 types of fearlessness. And these are 4 types of proclamations that only a Buddha can make, that a Buddha can make without fear of being untruthful. And so the first one is that the Buddha can proclaim, there are 2 that relate to the Buddha himself or themselves, and 2 that relate to others. So the 2 that relate to the Buddha themselves is that they can proclaim that they have realized all good qualities and have all realizations, right? So sometimes this is called the fearlessness of having an omniscient mind, but they have realized completely all good qualities and all realizations. And so they can proclaim that without the fear of being untruthful. And the other one is that they can proclaim that they have eliminated all obscurations and afflictions. So those are the 2 types of fearlessness related to themselves. And then the two types of fearlessness related to others is that they can proclaim that they have taught the path of the antidotes. So they have taught the positive path of what you need to practice to achieve liberation yourself. And they can also proclaim that they have taught what is to be avoided. So they have taught the path of what needs to be abandoned and avoided in order to reach enlightenment. So the two types of way they have taught all of the objects that need to be adopted and all of the objects that need to be abandoned. And they themselves have realized all good qualities and achieved all realizations. And they have themselves eliminated all obscurations and afflictions. And they can make any statement or any damjua, any proclamation to that effect without the fear of being untruthful. So these 4 types of fearlessness that we have to study. When you study like the 70 topics and all these like long lists of different attributes of the Buddha, that's one of them, is that the Buddha has these 4 fearlessnesses. It's a very hard word to say in English. I don't even know if it is a word, but. So in that way, one of the characteristics of a Buddha that make them an authentic source of refuge is that they have no fear. And then the second one is that they have the ability to, or they're skilled in the method of dispensing or dispelling fear for others. So through their teaching, both their teaching, their actual, the teaching they give and the teaching they live in example, they're able to dispel others' fear because they're able to teach you the way to be free from suffering, right? And they also can teach you how to overcome worldly fears as well. So they not only are free from all fears themselves, but they are able and skilled in dispelling others' fears. So for example, there may be, I'm sure you've met people, never mind Buddhism, but like you've met people who are really good at a thing, whatever it may be, but they're really crap at teaching others how to do that thing. Like they may be really good at this thing, but they just can't communicate about it, right? So if we're thinking about trying to be free from samsara, you need to have both those qualities to be a source of refuge. Just because you yourself are free from suffering, if you can't convey to me how I can be free from suffering, then you're no help to me, right? If you can't convey it in a meaningful way that students can understand. So those two are important and they go together. Then the next two are that a Buddha has impartial compassion for all sentient beings, regardless of if they help or they help or harm them. So the wish for all sentient beings to be free from suffering entirely, that is impartial. It does not depend upon the person's devotion, the person's religious status, the person's kindness. Doesn't matter. And not just person. The person in the sense of the word of a sentient being, a non-Buddha sentient being. And a Buddha has impartial or acts with impartiality for all sentient beings. So not only do they have compassion that is impartial, but their actions aren't impartial. You know, and the example they always give is that if the Buddha had one person on one side rubbing perfumed oil and giving him a massage, and the other side had someone stabbing him with a knife, he would act equally to benefit both of them. And he wouldn't favor one over the other because he's completely impartial in his compassion and in his actions for other sentient beings. So those 4 characteristics of a Buddha are what we seek out to identify them as an authentic source of refuge and as fulfilling the needs or the characteristics of being an authentic, the authentic Buddha jewel. And in the teachings, they don't then expand those 4 points to the other 2 refuges, the Dharma refuge or the Sangha refuge, but you can think of them in the same way, that they're used as an example. Then you could think that the other 2 sources of refuge or the other 2 refuges also need to have these characteristics, right? That they embody the Dharma itself and that they're able to present that Dharma in a way that is meaningful to others. So I guess the question is, the important, we simply go to refuge for protection, right? How does our refuge, how do the 3 jewels actually protect us from suffering? If we say that's the point of refuge, right, is to protect us from suffering, or to protect us in this case from to allay our fear of being reborn in the lower realms or our fear of being reborn in samsara, how do the 3 jewels actually offer us protection? What does that look like? Yeah, showing us the way and showing us the way and giving us the confidence to understand what it means to practice the way, right? And so this is one of the reasons that I think the FPMT puts karma first. Understanding karma is one of the fundamental aspects of the Dharma jewel. right? So we again say the real refuge is in the Dharma jewel. The Buddha can teach us the Dharma, and they can model the Dharma for us, and the Sangha can then help guide us and continue modeling it as well, right? And they can be an example. But in the end, we have to realize the Dharma jewel in ourselves, and it's the Dharma jewel that's the actual teachings that are going to free us from samsara, right? So that's why it's the actual refuge. And in many ways, the Dharma jewel, one of the most important teachings is on understanding karma and its results, right? Understanding how our actions in this life or our experience in this life have been shaped by actions we've done in the past, and how our actions in this life are going to be creating causes for what we experience in the future, whether it be in this life or in future lives. And actually understanding that intellectually, but then also realizing it, like really understanding it, not just having an intellectual understanding of it, then that is what it means to really understand the protection of the Dharma jewel, because that is what changes our behavior, right? So refuge is what transforms our intellectual understanding into an emotional understanding, or an experiential understanding, right? If you read all of the Dharma teachings and you understand them, and even if you believe them, if you don't actually have refuge, if you don't have confidence that the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the actual legitimate ways to be free from suffering, then it's like those teachings are very dry. They don't infiltrate your mind. They don't actually affect how you behave in the world, because they just become an academic subject for you to study, right? But what refuge does is refuge is like the rain that then allows them to grow, allows them to prosper in your mind, right? And allows you to put them into practice. So I think of refuge as being the transformation from an academic or an intellectual understanding into an experiential or an emotional understanding of all the teachings. And that is how the refuge protects us, is because it transforms our actions, right? An actual refuge transforms our actions. So we're not just thinking about things, but we're actually living those things. And we're embodying the three jewels. We're embodying the teachings of the Dharma, the realizations of the Dharma in our everyday life to the best of our abilities and to the best of our understanding, right? And I'm sure it's possible to do that to some extent without refuge. And, or, excuse me, I know it is. And you look at other people in different spiritual traditions who are very good people, right? And they live, beneficial lives where they help others, and they don't have refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So it's obviously possible to be a good person without having refuge. Yet we would still say that by having refuge and recognizing the teachings of the Buddha, Dharma, and recognizing the three jewels as the ultimate sources of refuge, then you are setting yourself up for a spiritual life in a way that is more profound and more meaningful, and is based in a more in-depth and realistic understanding of the nature of reality, right? Now, again,
Vimla, I have a question.
sure.
It's just something I personally struggle with. When I read the teachings, I have faith that because my gurus are saying it, but then I haven't realized it myself. So when you say that taking refuge will enrich your spiritual life, I believe you, but I haven't personally experienced that. So how do I navigate that sense of doubt and uncertainty?
That's a good question. Did you guys hear the question? I don't know if the people in the room did. So to some extent, Buddhism is famous for saying that we don't require blind faith. And that's how it's different from a lot of other traditions. And that's true. Buddhism doesn't expect us to believe something simply because the Buddha said it or because our teacher said it. But there is some expectation of some level of faith that we like to think of, or often is translated more as a confidence that is based on our experience. So an experiential faith. So as you say, that you have confidence in your teachers because they have taught things that have been meaningful to you, and you see how they live their lives. And based on that confidence, that when they say things that you don't have a personal experience of, you still have the faith that what they're saying is an accurate representation of Dharma and of an important way to live your life. And so then how do you have that lack of experience, that faith that is born in your experience of your guru, but not in the subject matter? How does that become something you try to realize in your life? And how can you wrap your head around it? And I think part of the practice is constantly investigating that. So Buddhism encourages skepticism, right? And for me, I like to distinguish between skepticism and cynicism. So cynicism is doubting everything but believing you're always right. Like cynicism is usually founded in, is based in ego, whereas skepticism is saying that I want to investigate things before I accept them blindly, right? Not accepting things at face value and doing some sort of investigation into them. So they might look the same on the outside, but I think that their fundamental nature is somewhat different. And so Buddhism encourages us to have a skeptical mind, which is why the Dalai Lama often says that, like, Westerners and people with Western education are like prime students for the Dharma because they are raised to be skeptics. So we have to use that skeptical mind. So when we are taught things and we have confidence that the teachings are genuine and they're accurate, but we don't have an experiential understanding of them, then we bring those doubts into our meditation practice, right? We try to actually sit with those doubts and say, what is it about this topic that I don't have an understanding of yet? Like, why is it not something that I have an experience of? And really investigate what it would take for your mind to become suffused enough with that topic that you actually have confidence in it. And it isn't something that develops right away, but you allow yourself to be skeptical. And instead of just being skeptical and then ignoring it, you take that skepticism into your practice and you say, what am I missing that would transform this into being something else for me, to being something I could live in my everyday life? And so the reason I think of refuge as being that like refreshing rain that waters those seeds of doubt is because that refuge, when we actually meditate on refuge and we look at the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha as being these authentic, pure sources of refuge, and recognizing that there is no authentic refuge other than them, when we're actually able to develop a mind that is confident of that, fully confident of that, then that allows those teachings that we may not have personal experience of to become easier to develop confidence in practice, because we have confidence in the source. So refuge allows us to develop stronger confidence in the source, and therefore everything that comes from the source is easier for us to put into practice in that way. But again, I wish it was like an overnight thing that you could just like develop refuge and everything else would be immediate. But really, it's going to have to, for me, at least in my experience, it is allowing yourself to be comfortable with your doubt and with your skepticism. And instead of allowing that to push the teachings away, bring your skepticism into your practice and make that part of your practice, because it's through skepticism that you then understand something on your own. As part of the reason we use debate as the main pedagogy at the monastery is that when I debate, I have to make a statement that I understand the meaning of whatever this text is. And then the person debating against me is trying to prove me wrong, they can lie, they can be manipulative, they can do whatever they want to try to shake me from my position. And if I really understand this material, then no matter what they say, I'm able to have confidence in my reply, right? And so it's only through testing your understanding of things that you'll really see, do I really believe this, or do I believe it because it's convenient? Like, what are the weak points in my own understanding and in my own argument? You know, is there actual armor around my belief, or is it made of bubble wrap only that is it seems like it's going to protect you, but one blade and it'll get through. So I think bringing that skepticism and doubt into your practice and trying to find comfort or a level of comfort with your doubt is a healthy way to engage in practice. And by doing that, it actually makes what you believe deeper and stronger, and it makes your practice more grounded and more experiential, at least in my experience. So I hope that helps a little bit. And I think refuge, really meditating on refuge, refuge is like, we recite refuge prayers at the beginning of every one of our sessions, right? Like, it's the beginning of any meditation session or any Dharma session, you're supposed to recite refuge prayer. And the teacher is very kind to make this very one nice little verse. That's refuge and bodhicitta, 4 lines, very easy, right? So it's almost a second nature to say it, but to actually generate a mind of refuge when you do it is difficult. And it's not something we're always used to. So really working to have a real experience of refuge. Like, I really believe that the Dharma is going to free me from suffering. And that if I can realize the Dharma every day, that I can realize the Dharma to one little bit more than I did the day before, that is going to bring me closer and closer to Buddhahood. And that there's nothing other than the teachings of the Buddha that are going to actually free me from suffering. If I actually have that faith, that confidence based in my own experience, my own investigation, and me overcoming my own doubts by looking at them and seeing how they live in my life, that actual refuge is what is going to propel my practice, my meditation. And without it, everything just becomes kind of bland. Like, there's less motivation. So it's worth looking at that mind of refuge, especially when you recite that refuge prayer and see, are you just reciting something or are you generating a mind of confidence? And that's what I'm going to get to next, or very shortly, is like, what are the marks of actually going for refuge? What are the characteristics of it? What is expected of us when we say I have a mind of refuge? What does that mean? So that's why I think refuge is important. And part of the reason when I do the prayers here, I like to do the refuge prayer in Tibetan, simply because I find that doing it with a tune allows us to have a more emotional experience of it than just reciting it without a tune does. And that just is maybe my own personal bias, right? Because we don't need to recite it at all. Like it's a mental practice. Refuge is a mind. It's a type of mind. There's nothing to do with what we proclaim with our mouths. But for me personally, having a tune, that tune and that melody connects me to a lineage of practice and to a certain community, which is just meaningful to me. But then it gives me one other external support. Part of the reason there's so much ritual in Tibetan Buddhism is because our minds are so distracted all the time that any small little tool we can use to help us, we do. And so all of this external ritual is just one little tool to help get our minds in order, right? When you have a perfectly clear mind, you don't need any of this external stuff, right? So for me, that's part of the reason I like to recite with melody. And we only have a melody for the Tibetan, which is why I use the Tibetan instead of the English. So I think it's an important thing to think about with refuge. Okay, moving on a little bit. So it's one thing that's important to know about refuge is that we talk about refuge, we're really referencing the outer refuge. There's also what's known as the inner refuge. And so the outer refuge is the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? The inner refuge, so for instance, the inner Buddha jewel is the Buddha that you will become through your own practice. That's inseparable from your own continuum. And the inner Dharma jewel is the realization and nature of reality that you will have in your continuum when you become a Buddha that you will then teach to others. And the inner Sangha jewel is your identity as a Arya being in the future, right? So the inner refuges are inseparable from your own continuum, whereas the outer refuges that we actually go to refuge for have a separate continuum than you do, right? They're not part of the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, or all the other Buddhas are not the same continuum as me. They're separate from me. The Dharma itself is separate from me. The Sangha is separate from me. So when I go for refuge, I'm going to refuge. My actual source of refuge is the outer refuge. But it's important to think of the inner refuge, at least for me. I'm not going to refuge. I'm not going to the inner jewels or the inner sources of refuge for refuge, but I'm recognizing them as refuges that will exist in the future, if that makes sense. And for me, it's useful to remember because it's just a reminder that this path leads me towards Buddhahood, right? And eventually, when I become Buddha, the Dharma jewel in my mind will be no different than the Dharma jewel in the mind of all my teachers and the Dharma jewel of all the Buddhas. It'll be indistinguishable. It's not there yet because I haven't had those levels of realization. But when I do, then it will be the same. And there will not be any distinction. And that capacity is something that's in me right now. Just because I haven't realized it doesn't mean I don't have the capacity for it. So when I go for refuge, I'm not going to myself for refuge. I'm not looking in a mirror and going, ooh. But I am remembering that all of those things I go to refuge for, to the external sources of refuge, I have the capacity for all of them in myself, and they eventually will be fully realized. And that is at least strengthens my practice, right? It doesn't really strengthen my refuge, but it strengthens my practice. So it's useful to remember. And so when I that encourages me to try to then embody the three objects of refuge, right? Because I know that I have the potential to realize all of them in my own continuum. The three inner sources of refuge exist, and therefore I try to embody them in my practice, my practices of accumulating merit and practices of accumulating wisdom. So part of living a spiritual life and trying to walk on a spiritual path is trying to embody the three jewels. And before, I want to talk about the what is translated often as the measure of taking refuge. So what is expected when you have a mind of refuge? What the characteristics that describe that mind? But first, before I do that, I just wanted to point out in the prayer that we recite, the prayer at the beginning, the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, right? after the initial verses that are just Shakyamuni Buddha, we have these 3 verses that are each for the 3 different sources of refuge, right? On page 74 and 75 for our book. And I won't go into them too much now, but I think they're worth looking at when you're trying to think about refuge, because they give you different aspects of the 3 jewels. So the 3rd verse down or 4th verse down on page 74, this is the Buddha jewel, right? The savior having great compassion, the founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, Chiyu, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. So that's acknowledging 4 different characteristics of the Buddha jewel, right? And then, so that one, the Buddha jewel is the one that's easiest to kind of explain. And we're going to talk about it more in a moment. But then the Dharma jewel, the purity that frees one from attachment, right? So the Dharma itself is free from all stains. The Dharma itself is perfectly pure. And by following that perfectly pure understanding or nature of the nature of reality, we are free from attachment as well as anger, as well as ignorance, right? But specifically attachment to this life. So the Dharma itself is perfectly pure. It is the virtue that frees one from the lower realms. So the Dharma itself embodies what it means to engage in the practice of virtue. So we study the 10 virtuous minds and so forth, or the 10 virtuous actions and so forth. And so the Dharma itself is what embodies those. And it's by practicing virtue that we actually are able to free ourselves from the suffering of the lower realms. So this is why when we say understanding cause and effect is the heart of understanding the Dharma jewel, is because understanding what is virtue and what is not virtue, understanding what is suffering and what is not suffering is critical to allowing yourself to realize the Dharma jewel. And then the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, that prostrates. So the one path, the Dharma itself is the way of engaging. It is the teaching itself. It is the nature of reality, but it's also how to go about practicing the path of the spiritual path, right? The Dharma itself is the path, and it is the meaning. It is the message and the path both, if that makes sense. And it pacifies, right? So here, the word for I guess pacify is okay. Shigyur, so to make peaceful, right? But to pacify, to diminish. We think of how disrupted our minds are, to pacify them by allowing the medicine of the Dharma to kind of reduce the fever of our minds, right? So this is describing the characteristics of the Dharma. And then the Sangha, to those who are liberated, and who also show the path to liberation. Then the holy field qualified with realization. So the holy field means it is the holy field upon which we make offerings, and we receive merit by making offerings to them. So it's often called the merit field, right? The merit field is because they are the basis upon which, by making offerings, we accumulate merit. They have realizations because they have understood the nature of reality. So to be an authentic member of the Dharma jewel, it isn't just a Sangha. So Sangha are the conventional Dharma jewel, but the actual Dharma jewel are Arya beings that have a direct realization into the nature of reality. So they have realizations, and they're devoted to the moral precepts. So an actual member of the Sangha jewel holds vows and is committed to actually putting the Dharma into practice, right? And so I think these verses are nice. We recite them every day before our practice, but because they're giving you more details about what the 3 jewels represent. So I just wanted to point that out, that they give you a little bit bigger context. Okay, so what is the...
Sorry, can I have a question before we move on? Could you please repeat what was the inner Sangha jewel, please?
The inner Sangha jewel is very similar to the inner Buddha jewel, except that when the inner Sangha is the Arya being that you will become when you have a direct realization of the nature of reality, or direct realization of emptiness, that is. So that is what characterizes the inner, the Sangha jewel in general, right? The Sangha jewel, this will probably come up next week, I imagine, if we're following the normal kind of Lamrim order of teaching things. But when we look at the 3 jewels, we have the conventional 3 jewels and the actual 3 jewels. And the conventional Sangha is anyone holding vows. So that's what we use as our Sangha community, or the conventional Sangha. But the actual Sangha are any being that has realized the nature of reality directly. So any Arya being. And so the inner Sangha jewel is the Arya being you will become when you have a direct realization of emptiness.
Venerable, could you also repeat the inner Buddha and the inner Dharma jewel? I just missed.
Yeah, so the inner Buddha jewel is the Buddha you will become when it is the Buddha you will be in the future. So it's your capacity. We all have the capacity, right? We have Tathagata Garbha, as they say, the seed of enlightenment, or the embryo of enlightenment. So all sentient beings have the same capacity to become Buddhas. So when that capacity is fully realized and we become Buddhas, that Buddha we will become is the Buddha, our inner Buddha jewel that isn't realized now. It's only in a latent state now. It's our capacity now, but it will be a Buddha in the future. And then the Dharma jewel is, you can say it has two aspects. It is the realization, like the realization of, how do you say? We could say it's our omniscient mind that we'll have when we become a Buddha, and also our realization of the nature of reality, and also the teachings that we will then share to others after we have become Buddha. So all of those things at the time of achieving Buddhahood, what we understand is the Dharma jewel now, when that is fully and completely realized in our mental continuum without any obscurations or any stains or any confusion or anything like this, then that is our inner Dharma jewel. So it's our complete and stain-free realization of the Dharma, which will happen when we achieve Buddhahood.
Okay, thank you.
Because the Dharma is what we want. I mean, we think of the Dharma jewel as the teaching, right? It's showing us the path, but it is also the path itself. That's what I was trying to say. I don't know if I have the right language for it, but the Dharma jewel is showing us the path of practice. It's the teaching, like the teachings of the Buddha are considered the Dharma jewel. So those are the kind of the actual teachings where we're absorbing them. But in order for them to be meaningful to us, we have to realize them, to actualize them. So the Dharma jewel itself is the path, but it's also the practices of the path. Do you know what I mean? Like it is the lamp that shows the path, but the path itself. It's both of those things, right? And so when we realize it, then we don't need the lamp anymore because we are the lamp. We are the path. So that's a matter of realizing the Dharma jewel. And so that is when we fully and completely realizing it without any doubts or obscurations. That's the inner Dharma jewel. So the measure of taking refuge. So what does it mean to actually have a mind of refuge? There are often taught to be 4 characteristics to the mind of refuge. Now, those of us that have gone for refuge and actually have refuge in our mind, we may not have all of these explicitly. So don't worry. If you're like, wait, I don't have this thing explicitly, right? Most of us have some sort of implicit understanding of these, even if we don't have the language for it. So don't be worried that I actually have never gone for refuge because I don't know all these details. These are just kind of the expansive way to understand it. It's useful to study, though, to make sure that we actually have them in our mind. So the first, I'll go through them. I'll just outline the 4, and then I'll go through them in detail. So the measure of taking refuge, there are 4 things that we have to measure. The first one is knowing the good qualities of the objects of refuge. I think you started this last week with Gyalten. And then the second is knowing the differences between the 3 objects of refuge. The third is taking refuge with relationship or owing to your own beliefs in the 3 jewels. And then the last one is recognizing and taking refuge in the Buddhas, in the 3 jewels as authentic sources of refuge, and recognizing that there does not exist any authentic source of refuge outside of the 3 jewels. So those all 4 components are needed for an actual mind of refuge to exist. And so the first one, and so I'll go through them again, but very briefly again, the outline is knowing the characteristics or the qualities of the objects of refuge. That's number 1. Knowing the differences between the 3 objects of refuge is number 2. Going for refuge owing to your belief or understanding of the 3 objects of refuge, or the nature of the 3 objects of refuge, and recognizing that not only are the 3 objects of refuge, the 3 jewels, authentic sources of refuge, but that no authentic source of refuge exists outside of those 3. So those are the 4 types of things that we have to have, the qualities of a mind that actually goes to refuge. If we don't have all 4 of those completely, then we don't have an actual refuge. We have only a partial refuge. So the first one, knowing the good qualities of the objects of refuge, right? So this is knowing the good qualities of the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and then knowing the good qualities of, knowing the good qualities of all 3 individually. And then for the first one, It's knowing the good qualities of the Buddha's body, of the Buddha's speech, of the Buddha's mind, and of the Buddha's actions. And then the Dharma and Sangha aren't subdivided that way. So I know some of this was covered last week, but knowing the good qualities of the Buddha's body, one way we describe it is that the Buddha has the 32 major marks and the 80 minor signs. And if you don't know all 112 of those, that's okay. For me, knowing the good qualities of the Buddha, I mean, it's important to study those. And if you find a text that teaches them, like the Great Liberation Sutra, which I translated as one teaching that teaches about them, it teaches what each of them represents. So like the Buddha has these 32 marks, and why does a Buddha have these 32 marks? Like, what does each one represent? And they each represent some sort of mental state, right? It's a physical embodiment of some sort of realization or some mental state or an abandonment or something like this. For me, this is the importance of recognizing the good characteristics of the body of a Buddha, is that the body of a Buddha is miraculous, and that the body of a Buddha is manifest in such a way that meets the needs of the students, right? So there is a very traditional way to understand this. Like I said, understanding the 32 and the 80. And it's important to understand those. But for me, the quick understanding of it is that recognizing that the Buddhas take the bodies they need in order to meet the needs of the students. So not all Buddhas have those 32 and 80. That's what's a certain type of Buddha, supreme emanation beings, right? There's different types of Buddha bodies, and a supreme emanation being has the 32 and the 80. Not all Buddhas do. His Holiness Dalai Lama does not have all of those marks, right? Like he doesn't have, like wheels on his palms, on palms of his hands and so forth. So for me, what's important for this one is recognizing that the body of a Buddha meets the needs of the students that is being taught by that Buddha. And so the body of the Buddha itself has these miraculous capacities where the realizations of the Buddha are manifest in their body, or they have the capacity to be, when that is useful for the students. And that's enough for that. If we look at Shakyamuni Buddha, we can go through all the details of his body, but I don't know if that's necessary. Then the understanding the qualities of the Buddha's speech, sometimes there are described either 60 or 64 different characteristics of the Buddha's speech. It's incredibly melodious. It's pleasant to hear. Just by hearing it, it calms your mind, it brings you peace, and so forth. One of the most important qualities of the speech of a Buddha is that the speech of a Buddha, again, meets the needs of a student. So if the Buddha had 3 students in front of him, he could say one thing, and it would be heard differently by those 3 students to overcome whatever obstacles they were experiencing. It's one of the miraculous capacities of the Buddha's speech. What I think of this, obviously we have this miraculous and like legendary mythical understanding of what the Buddha was and how Buddhas exist in the world. That isn't often how we experience Buddhas, right? Like that is the archetypical Buddha, that Shakyamuni Buddha. So I have faith in all these characteristics of a Buddha, even if I don't have direct experience of them. But the importance for studying these is because then we see echoes of them in our lives, right? So for instance, one of the characteristics of the Buddhist speech, like this, the Buddha can say one thing and it's heard differently by different students depending on their needs. That goes along with the teaching on we should receive every teaching from our gurus as personal instruction, right? And so an example of that I had in my life, to give some sort of worldly example, is when I first moved to India to ordain, I ordained with Kusho Chudran Rinpoche, and he told me to come to India in October, but he didn't know when he was going to offer ordination. So I just had to be ready. So I moved to India in the end of September. And then he didn't actually offer ordination until the end of January. So from the end of September through January, I was living at Sarah as a layperson. And that December / the beginning of January, His Holiness Dalai Lama gave teachings in Bodh Gaya. So we all went to Bodh Gaya. And I was staying with the monks from my house, even though I was not yet a monk. They let me stay with them. So we were staying at Root Institute, which is the FPMT center in Bodh Gaya. And one day before the teaching started, Lama Zopa came, right? So of course, all of us that were at the center lined up to receive him. And next to me was a woman who had been a nun and had since disrobed. And while she was a nun, and also now, she had been studying throat singing and how to do both Mongolian throat chanting, but also like if you go to see a traditional Tibetan umze, they do like a type of chanting that's in their throat. It's not the same as Mongolian, but it has some similar characteristics, right? So she'd been studying that and practicing it. And that was like something she was really proud of. And she started it when she was a nun. And then she disrobed. I don't know her reasons for disrobing, but she continued and has gotten much better at throat chanting. So she said. And so she was standing right next to me in line. And Rinpoche comes. And I have met Rinpoche a number of times beforehand, right? He's the one who told me to become a monk. But I haven't met him in India since, this is the first time this close to my ordination, being in person with him. So he's right next to me. And Rinpoche sees her. And he looks at me and he sees her and he goes, oh. And she goes, what did she say? He goes, you do the chanting. She goes, yeah. And she's, I've been practicing. He goes, oh, you used to be a nun, right? She goes, yeah, but I'm not. She goes, what was it? He's like, you used to be a nun, right? And she's like, yes. And he goes, oh. And then she made some comment about how she's been practicing her throat chanting. And he goes, oh, I think you were stronger when you were a nun. And she took that to mean that like she hadn't, that her throat chanting hadn't gotten better or something like that. She took it, all she was focused on was like her practicing of this throat chanting. But for me, I heard him say, you were stronger when you were a nun, which is showing the benefit of being an ordained person. As someone who is on the precipice of taking vows, right? For me, he was saying one thing to her, but what I heard him say to me was different, right? It was the same words, but the meaning I took was wildly different than the meaning she took. And maybe that's my own imagination, right? Who knows what that is? But for me, I understand it's one of the miraculous abilities of the Buddha to speak in one way, but meet different students' needs, right? So I felt Rinpoche was directly speaking to me at that moment when he was talking to this former nun next to me. And so that isn't the exact same thing as the miraculous qualities of the Buddhist speech, but it's an echo of it in our life, right? And so that is what is useful to understand the quality of the Buddhist speech, is that we can see it echoed in our understanding when we read the teachings and when we receive teachings from teachers. Then the Buddhist,
but that's because, couldn't that also be because we interpret everything based on through the prism of our mind? So obviously, we are not all or ever going to have the same understanding, whatever. I guess even if the Buddha was speaking to me, I guess I would just be understanding through my own, unique whatever, and someone else would be. So isn't that what's happening?
Well, so that may be what's happening in my example, right? But so the characteristic of the Buddha, what they actually say is, when the Buddha says one thing, if you're a student who believes that things exist inherently, then you will hear him say nothing, like all phenomena does not exist inherently. And if another student believes all things exist permanently, they will hear the Buddha say everything exists is impermanent. And so the Buddha will say the same words, but it'll actually be heard differently because he can speak in multiple languages simultaneously. Like one of the miraculous abilities of the Buddhist speech is that it speaks multiple languages. So if you and I may not speak the same language, but the Buddha speaks, we can both understand it. And we'll understand it in a way that's fitting for our mind. So that's the miraculous quality of the Buddha. And my example of hearing Lama Zopa speak in that way is, like you said, it's me interpreting it, right, through my own mental experience. So that's why I said it may not be the exact same thing, but it's an echo of it. So it's an echo of that miraculous capacity of a Buddha in my everyday life.
So, but then how is it different from what is the miraculous part about the Buddha?
Well, so this one isn't miraculous. My example isn't miraculous. It's an echo of the quality of a Buddha speech, right?
Okay.
Right. So the Buddha speech, like he said, everyone in his audience could speak different languages. The Buddha would speak one language and they'd all understand him, as well as the Nagas and as well as the other animals and all the other beings that were in that space could understand him, even if they couldn't understand each other. So that's like one of the most long touted characteristics of the Buddhist speech, is that he would speak in one language and everyone would understand him no matter what language they spoke. So that is a miraculous quality of his speech, right? So I don't have that experience in my life, but I can see echoes of it when my teacher is saying one type of thing to one person, and what that means for that person and what it means for me is different. you're right that comes from my own mental space, my own understanding, my own study, my own practice. But that is one of the characteristics of the Dharma, is that if the Dharma is always a personal instruction, then we can recognize that our teacher is doing that intentionally and skillfully. So the teacher is choosing the words to say in such a way that it'll be interpreted one way for me and one way for another. So, he didn't, anyway. The example that I gave, you're correct, that it is due to my own personal mental experience. The reason it is different than just me saying something and everyone here interpreting it differently is because at least my confidence in my guru as representing or embodying the three jewels of refuge is that he was saying it intentionally. Whereas if I say something here tonight and you understand it one way and you understand it some way else and you understand it someone else, that's just because I'm not clear enough in my explanation. Like that's an accident of my lack of understanding, right? And it's not an intentional thing. Whereas the Buddhas do it intentionally, where they say, I know what he needs and I know what she needs. So I'm going to say the one thing that's going to speak to their two needs simultaneously from their side. So that's the distinction. Whereas if everyone here has a different meaning from my words tonight, that's just due to my inability to express myself clearly, combined with your own inner understanding, right? So it's a little bit different. At least my belief in it is different. Okay, moving on quickly. The uncommon characteristics of the Buddha's mind. There are lists and lists and lists and lists of these. The important thing to think about is that the Buddha's mind, we think of it, the two types of characteristics, either ones that are born from the Buddha's omniscience, so the Buddha's ability to know all phenomena simultaneously, and the Buddha's infinite compassion. So those are two types of mind the Buddha has. And so all of the characteristics of the Buddha's mind that are worth our emulation come from those two things. And again, that just shows the constant inseparability of method or compassion and wisdom, right? So all of the good characteristics of the Buddha's mind, there are very long lists, but from the Buddha's omniscience and the Buddha's love or compassion. So any characteristic that comes from those. And if we recognize the Buddha has that every action the Buddha takes is coming from a place of perfect wisdom and perfect compassion or perfect love, then that allows us to understand, or at least have a taste of the Buddha's mental capacity. And then lastly, the Buddha's deeds. Again, there are many lists. I think it is often like there's like 9 similes of how the Buddha's deeds work in the world that come from different sutras. The important thing to take from recognizing the holy qualities of the Buddha's deeds, or the characteristics of the deeds of the Buddha, are that the Buddha acts in such a way that meets the needs of the students so that the students can realize or achieve all realizations when it is the appropriate time for them to do so. So the Buddha's deeds are in concert with the needs of the students. So the Buddha's deeds won't push someone too far if they're not prepared for it. He won't answer in such a way that it'll cause them doubt or confusion. And he will push them when they need to be pushed and when they can be pushed in the direction of liberation. So the Buddha's deeds are always in alignment with the needs of the students to maximize their ability to realize the path and to come closer to liberation. So the Buddha's deeds are perfect in that way, even though the deeds will look different depending on the student that the Buddha is interacting with. So those are the qualities of the Buddha. The Buddha's, when we're thinking of the individual qualities of the 3 jewels of refuge, the Buddha, we have to think of 4 different types of qualities of the Buddha's body, speech, mind, and the quality of the Buddha's deeds. When we think of the good qualities of the Dharma, it's simply that we think that all our good qualities, all our realizations, all of our abandonments of the afflictions come from the Dharma itself and from understanding the Dharma. So that is the main quality of the Dharma to realize, is that the Dharma itself and the realization of the Dharma is the cause for all of our progress towards liberation. Every realization we achieve and every abandonment that we abandon is due to the Dharma itself. So it's the primary cause of that. That's the good quality of the Dharma, the most important one to think of. And the good qualities of the Sangha is that they embody renunciation, the Sangha embodies renunciation, so the wish to be free from all suffering. They embody the realization or the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths are taught each with 4 characteristics, right? So there's 16 aspects to the Four Noble Truths in the traditional way they're taught. So they embody a realization of all of the Four Noble Truths, and they have a direct realization of the nature of reality. And so that is the uncommon characteristics of the Sangha. It does get a little bit, we could say that if the Sangha are all Arya beings, then the Buddha is also a member of the Sangha jewel, right? So there is overlap sometimes. So the Buddha and the Sangha do share characteristics because the Buddha is an Arya being, and all Arya beings are the Sangha jewel. But the uncommon characteristics of the Sangha jewel are their embodiment of renunciation, understanding of the Four Noble Truths, and direct realization of the nature of reality. So those are what it means to know the qualities of the different objects of refuge.
So where can I wanted to read the whole list.
In Pabonka Rinpoche's Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand gives a list. I'm also, I believe, in the Lamrim Chemo and other texts, but they are pulling them from a bunch of different sutras. So a lot of their lists are going to come from like different sources, but that would be one place to look. Then there are other sutras. I can't think of any off the top of my head though. That'd be a good place to start. And then with a lot of those, especially the newer editions of them, they often will have like an index or a footnote or like end note that says like this is coming from this sutra. So then you could actually then go cross-reference if you wanted to. So then of the 4 measures of taking refuge, that's the first one, knowing the distinction between the different objects of refuge. The second is, knowing the good qualities of the objects of refuge. The second is knowing the distinctions of the objects of refuge. And this is the one that you probably know all these already, but you wouldn't have put it in this language because it's like very convoluted language. So there are 6 different types of differences across the 3 objects of refuge that we're taught to know. I'm going to go through them really quickly because they're very straightforward and you would be like, oh yeah, okay, fine. Like these are things you know, but you just didn't realize that like someone took the time to enumerate them in this way, okay? So the first one is, if we're thinking about the differences, what are the 3 different characteristics of the 3 jewels of refuge? And so the Buddha has the characteristic of complete enlightenment. The Dharma has the characteristic of being the result of the Buddha coming to this world. And the Sangha has the characteristic rather of being practitioners of the Dharma, which itself is a result of the Buddha coming to this world. Right? So that's the difference of the characteristics, right? Complete enlightenment, the result of the Buddha's coming, and the result or the practitioners of the teachings of the Buddha. And then the second difference between the objects of refuge is the different type of good works or good deeds that are a result of the 3 objects of refuge. So the Buddha provides, in this context, the good deed is of the Buddha providing oral transmission of the teachings, actually speaking out the nature of reality, of the Dharma. The Dharma itself, the good work of the Dharma is to cause the abandonment of all that is to be abandoned. And the good work of the Sangha is to actually practice the Dharma, and by doing so, gain what is to be gained and serve as an example for those who wish to follow in the footsteps of the spiritual path. So providing the actual oral explanation of the teachings, that's the Buddha. The Dharma is actually showing what is to be abandoned and how to abandon it. And then the Sangha is embodying that practice. And by abandoning what needs to be abandoned, they achieve realizations and serve as examples. And then how do you consider the ways in which you consider them objects of refuge? This is actually an interesting one. So the Buddha is considered an object of refuge as something against which, especially for us now, to make offerings and to offer service, right? The Dharma is an object of refuge because that is the thing that we are supposed to make manifest in our mind. So the way and then the Sangha is the true friends that we have on our path to liberation. So this is an important one, I think. When we think of what it means to take refuge in the Buddha, it is that we offer respect and service and offerings to the Buddha due to the Buddha's capacity and realization of the nature of reality and teaching of it, right? So it's offering service and offering respect and making offerings. The Dharma itself, the way you take refuge in the Dharma is working to realize the Dharma in your mind, which means putting it into practice. That's what it means to take refuge in the Dharma. Just understanding the words of the Buddha, understanding it in an academic way, isn't taking refuge in it. Actually making it manifest in your actions of body, speech, and mind. That's what it means to take refuge. Otherwise, it's useless. Just knowing all the teachings doesn't do anything if you don't try to realize them. So what it means to take refuge in the Dharma is to actually do your best to realize it in your continuum, and that means in your actions. And then to take refuge in the Sangha is to recognize that there are examples who will not only show you what it's like to through their example, but also will guide you hand in hand if you allow them to. So that one I actually think is important.
How does one offer service to the Buddha?
Yeah, so then since we don't have the karma to be face-to-face with Shakyamuni Buddha, we offer service to the Buddha by offering service to anything that's a representative of the Dharma, because the Buddha himself is teaching the Dharma. So by offering service at a Dharma center, by offering teachings, by doing any act of service in reference to the Dharma is offering service to the Buddha, you know, and showing respect and so forth to images of the Buddha and so forth, like this is making offerings. Yeah, we can't. This is again when it comes back to when we said Ilama Tensu, proper devotion to a guru, that we have to look at our gurus as kinder to us than all the Buddhas, because they're actually manifest for us here and now, right? We're Shakyamuni Buddha. We don't have the karma to be face to face with Shakyamuni Buddha. So our gurus are more important to us than Shakyamuni Buddha was, or the other Buddhas even, because the other Buddhas aren't manifesting in a way that we have direct relations. But so then when we offer service to our gurus, that is offering service to all the Buddhas as well. And so anything that is in service of our gurus, such as working at a Dharma center, or as, you know, providing spiritual comfort to a friend, you know, or even the things we do in our everyday life outside of the Dharma center, if we do it with a Dharma mind, that is a type of offering service, or it can be, right? Then the fourth way to know the differences is that when you try to embody the three jewels, you do it differently for the three of them. So the Buddha, you embody the Buddha's example of what it means to actually have a full realization of the Dharma and to share that with others. The Dharma you put into practice by actually trying to follow the teachings and make them manifest in your mind. And you put the Sangha jewel into practice in your body in your continuum by, again, trying to engage in the practice and to assist others in the practice. So the way you embody the three jewels in your own practice is slightly different. The way you remember the jewels is different, and that's just because they have different good qualities. This is why this is redundant. If you know the good qualities of the jewels and you recognize that they're different, then by remembering them distinctly, that is the fifth characteristic, or the fifth difference is that you remember them differently. And lastly, the way they increase your merit is different. And the Buddha increases your merit because through your dependence on a single being. The Sangha increases your merit through your dependence on multiple beings. And the Dharma increases your merit in dependence on a non-person or a disembodied aspect. So again, like I said, these are kind of common sense, right? But when you actually are trying to understand what it means to understand the Dharma, you have to understand that the three jewels have different characteristics and they have differences among them. And so you don't, even though there are overlaps, and you can posit that the Buddha jewel is a representation of the Sangha jewel and so forth, you can find ways to have them overlap. Understanding their differences is important because the three jewels fulfill, here, let me do the condensed version of this. This is getting really wordy. The three jewels fulfill different roles in your spiritual life. That's the important part of this. Recognizing that the three jewels fulfill different roles in your spiritual life. And that gets back to understanding the analogy of the physician, that they fulfill these three different roles. And that actually comes to the next of these three, right? Your measure of taking refuge. First is understanding the objects, the good qualities of the objects of refuge, understanding the distinctions between them. The third one is owing to your own beliefs. This is really a byproduct of the second one, recognizing the distinction between the three and recognizing that they fulfill different roles in your spiritual life. And so recognizing that the Buddha is the one who diagnoses the illness, and therefore is what is the Buddha jewel is serving to point you in the right direction. The Dharma jewel is what you're supposed to realize and practice, and the Sangha jewel is what is supposed to help guide you after you already have received the instruction. That's the third one, your own belief. This is basically understanding the characteristics of the three jewels. And then the last one is also self-explanatory, recognizing that there is no authentic source of refuge outside of the three jewels. So I'll end it there. Let me go over those four again, just because I went through them really quickly. Again, this is what it means to actually have a mind of refuge. And for those of us that have taken refuge, I'm confident that you have this, but you may not have thought about all these specific words about it, right? Part of the teachings is that they can be quite pedantic and show you all these small details, and it can feel overwhelming. And I kind of laugh at it sometimes because it feels repetitive. But the reason for it is because we really need to let this sink into our minds. And so by having it spelled out in this great detail, this detail may not be something we take into our everyday life, right? You might look at this and be able to condense it to make it meaningful for your everyday life, but you have to understand the detail first before you can do that. Like that's like, for example, for those of us who have any sort of tantric practice, you know, a tantric practice is often called a self-generation. And so you visualize yourself as whatever Buddha you're practicing. And there are some self-generations that are called the extensive self-generation, and that might take an hour, right? It might take an hour to sit and do the meditation. And then there's the condensed self-generation that might take 10 or 15 minutes. And a lot of people like to do the condensed ones. But what they say is that the condensed ones are for the people that already have high realizations. For those of us that are beginners, we need the extensive ones because we don't know all the details, right? So the ritual lays out all the specific details because you need them spelled out word by word by word because you're a beginner. But then once you have a realization of them, you can do the condensed one and it comes automatically, right? Now that's not how most of us practice because most of us just do the condensed ones. That's our problem. But so it's the same with this. When you learn things like the three jewels, you learn all these details that seem superfluous, they seem repetitive, they seem like you're talking about the exact same thing, but looking at it from different angles. And that's true. That's what they are. Well, they're not superfluous, but they are repetitive and they are looking at one topic, but from every possible angle. And the reason they're doing that is to make sure you have an understanding of it. So then when you bring it into your everyday life, you can bring the most important parts of your understanding into your everyday practice, right? So every one of these details may not be critical for your everyday practice, but it's important to at least understand them so that when you develop a realization of it in your everyday life, you aren't blindsided by something. Do you know what I mean? So again, the measure of taking refuge, what it means to have a mind of refuge, has to have these four characteristics. The first one is that you understand the good qualities or the good characteristics of all the three jewels of refuge. The second one is that you understand the distinctions or the differences between the three jewels of refuge. The third one is that you have a belief in those distinctions and how they apply differently to your practice. So it's called owing to your own beliefs is how it's referenced. And then the fourth one is recognizing not only that all three jewels are authentic sources of refuge, but that there is no authentic source of refuge outside of the three jewels. Having those four characteristics are what makes an actual mind of refuge. Or a complete mind of refuge, a non-partial mind of refuge. So I think I'll end it there. But to condense all that, you know, the Sangha jewel, and to some extent the Buddha jewel, are who you make offerings to in order to gain realizations and to gain assistance in understanding the path. The Buddha jewel is by serving the Buddha jewel, you then develop the Dharma jewel in your mind. So you make offerings to the Sangha, you serve the Buddha, and you develop the Dharma. And that is not a complete understanding, but it's a quick shortcut way to think of it. You know, you make offerings to the Sangha, and by doing so, you follow their examples, you see them as role models. You serve the Buddha, which is to see the Buddha as being the one that shows through their example and through their speech what is the actual nature of reality. So by serving them, you are bringing yourself closer to that direct transmission, and then you develop the Dharma. So that is like the real critical thing. Having a refuge in the Dharma doesn't just mean believing the law and cause and effect is true. It doesn't just mean believing in past and future lives. It doesn't just mean believing these things. It means developing a realization of all the teachings of the Buddha in your mental continuum. That's what it means to have refuge. That is the most important one. Develop realizations of the Dharma in your mind, in your mental continuum. That is refuge in the Dharma. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. It's already 7. Are there any questions, though? We have some time for some questions, I think. There are any? If not, there's still 1 class left in this series. Bangalore Lekden will be back next week in person, right? I think. So just know that he'll be able to wrap up everything. And I will say, like, as a little sneak peek, he'll be talking about the benefits of refuge. And then also when you take refuge, there are commitments, right? So there are the things, activities and mental habits you're supposed to adopt and things you're supposed to abandon by taking refuge. So that's going to be a big part of what he talks about next week. But if there are any questions about what we talked about today or anything else, yeah.
I mean, there's one point which was free of attachment. I know attachment a lot of times is synonymous with not being good again, but is there something like...
Sorry, with not being what?
Attachment is bad.
It's bad, okay, yeah.
But is there something called like healthy attachment to a mentor or a guru? Like it may not necessarily be attachment in an unhealthy way, but in some sense, respect or gratitude of that person being there is there.
Yeah, so this is going to be one of the places where our translations kind of get in the way. So attachment in this regard is always unhealthy. And it's thinking specifically of the 3 poisons, right? Of anger, attachment, and ignorance. But what you're talking about is like you have devotion to a teacher or respect for a teacher that appears to be attachment, right? And so we might use like, I'm attached to my teachers in that way. So that isn't unhealthy. But part of the danger, at least this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, is like the way we understand things is dependent upon the way we label it, right? And so if I say, well, I'm attached to my teachers, what I mean is I am devoted to my teachers. By using the word attachment, I might actually start bringing in ideas of actual attachment. And it might, you know what I mean? And so the language itself, the label itself, doesn't really matter. It's a conceptual framework through which we engage in reality. But if we're not conscious of the conceptual frameworks we use, then they can influence the actual way we do, you know? So there is no such thing as healthy attachment, because attachment in that way is always grasping at something outside of ourselves as if it's going to provide us, if it's going to be a source of freedom or happiness. And it's not. It's always, even being attached to the Dharma is only helpful insofar as it allows us to transform ourselves. But if I believed it was going to do the work for me, that's what being attached to it would be, right? But there is, I mean, it gets difficult. So like desire, there are healthy desires. Like I say, I desire to become Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. That's a healthy desire, right? And then you say, well, that desire is really an aspiration, but not a desire that comes from attachment. And so then you get in the weeds. So the important thing I think of is whatever labels you use, whatever conceptual frameworks you use, see what are the ramifications of that in your mind. And so being attached to your guru or to the teachings is fine if it doesn't mean that you expect you're sacrificing your own autonomy and you are actually believing that something outside of yourself is going to actually do the work for you, right? And so, for instance, if I were to insult your teacher, then would that cause disturbance in your mind? And if it would, then that level of attachment isn't healthy because you're actually attached to the idea of your teacher, not to the realizations your teacher embodies, right? So just, it isn't necessarily unhealthy like what you're describing, but then it's useful to think about though, you know? And I will say, like, this is a translation thing, but also in Tibetan, some of the same word, like the word for attachment that we're translating is duchak, but the word for desire is often just dupa. So it's the first half of duchak. So when you say like just desire something, it can be dupa, and that dupa can be good or bad. And then in conventional Tibetan, like to say I want something, you use that same word. Like I want to go to the store, dupa. Like I want to do something. So like the language is not. Since I learn it in Tibetan, like the weird things in Tibetan, I'm used to them, and the translating into English makes it harder. But English itself isn't the problem. Its language is the problem, because the relationship between our conceptual understanding of the world and the way we try to contain it within language is just difficult. You know what I mean? Sorry, I hope I didn't make it more confusing.
Genla, I have a question.
There's a few. So Tanta is one, that's like thirsting. But for the 3 poisons. I'm not sure what it is. Is it Tishna, maybe? I'm not sure. Yes, this question.
Kendra, you spoke about the 6 characteristics of samsara, and I
Mhm.
remember studying the 4 seals when it came to refuge. I was just wondering if you could tell me what's the connection, because I think the first 2 are there in the 4 seals.
You mean the 4 seals and that all phenomena are impermanent and all contain
Also
these 4 seals?
contaminated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that they are just different ways of looking at. Well, the 4 seals are more expensive, right? Than the first 2 seals are describing the how do you say in English? The the negative aspects of samsara, whereas the latter 2 seals are their capacity for to be empty, right? And to be free of self. So I think it's just a condensed and extensive way of talking about the same thing. When you think of the 6 characteristics of samsara that make it suffering, or that are a result of suffering, those first 2 seals are embodied in the same way. When you look at the 4 truths and you look at the truth of suffering, then the truth of suffering has 4 aspects, and the truth of the cause of suffering has 4 aspects. And these are just ways to be more extensive. But I think you're correct in that looking at the 4 seals, the first 2 seals are describing the nature of samsara, and you can look at the 6 characteristics of samsara being encompassed within those 2 that would not be inappropriate. Okay. A lot of what, this is something, a lot of the teachings of the Buddha are taught in multiple places and just some condensed ways and some expanded ways to meet different needs. And so there's a lot of, I don't want to say overlap, but just like different frameworks to make sure that everything, the way things fit together is understood, Okay. So if there are no more questions, maybe we will end it there. Let's dedicate. So we'll turn to the prayer book to page 36-ish. Yep, 36. So we can recognize that by coming together today to study the Dharma, we have accumulated some sort of merit, some good karma. And instead of keeping that karma for ourselves, we generate the wish or the desire, the dupa, to give that karma away, that other sentient beings might experience the results of our positive karma. And so we dedicate that karma specifically to our achieving Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. But we also dedicate it to all those who are suffering, that they might be free from suffering, all those who have passed away, that they might quickly achieve a perfect human rebirth and meet with the Mahayana virtuous friend, that all of our teachers may continue to manifest and display long health, long and healthy lives, that all of the wishes, holy wishes and activities of our teachers may continue without obstacles, and that we might continue to develop a spiritual practice that will allow us to be of maximum benefit to other sentient beings. So we dedicate any merit we've accumulated in this way. And so we'll offer these 2 verses of dedication, and then we'll offer a long life prayer for His Holiness Dalai Lama. And we'll do all 3 of these in English. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel of bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me this evening, for letting me be here. Just a reminder, there'll be class for those who are interested tomorrow morning at 10. And then also on Monday, on the actual holiday, there will be programming here at the center at 5, I believe, right? And I might be coming. I don't know. I'm going to try to. I'm in Bangalore anyway. I was supposed to be at Sarah because it's a holiday and there are things that I'm supposed to do at Sarah for the holiday, but then the head of the education office asked me to give some teachings at a college in Bangalore that we have an association with. So I'm going to be in Bangalore through Tuesday. And so I'm going to try to come tomorrow evening, but I'm not going to guarantee it. But not tomorrow, excuse me, Monday evening. But there are events here and they'll also be broadcast online, right? So we invite you to celebrate the turning of the Wheel of Dharma, the Buddhist first sermon, either here at the center or online with us. And hopefully I'll be here as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Venerable.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.